Started and people can come in a little bit late. I'm thrilled to see so many people here. When I woke up this morning, I thought, oh, nobody's going to show up. So thank you to all of you hardy souls for coming out in the cold. I'm really excited to introduce our speaker this morning. Jonathan Sharkin is the chair of the history department at the University of Denver. He teaches courses related to, related to the pre-modern and modern Middle East, the Israel and Palestine conflict, and U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. And this morning he's going to help put the Israel-Hamas conflict into some historical context. He'll speak for about 35 minutes and then take questions. So please give Professor Sharkin a warm Montview welcome.
Can everyone hear me? Yeah. First of all, thank you very much, Mary Jo, for the invitation, and it's really an honor to be able to speak at this church. And it's really nice. I know from looking on the website, I mean, this is a church whose congregation values lives on universally. So again, I'm really happy to be here. I want to just let you know in advance that I'm trying to provide a lot of historical context, but it's going to be superficial. I only have 35 minutes or so, which is fine. I didn't want to keep you here for 7 hours on a Sunday. And I'm teaching a course, an undergrad course right now on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at DU, and even in a 10-week course, I have to make a lot of decisions about what to choose and what not to choose. And so I would just ask that you assume the best of me here. I'm not omitting anything for political reasons. I am unfortunately going to have to omit a lot of historical context, even though I want to talk about historical context. So if you do have questions that and want me to fill things in, I will do my best in Q&A. One last warning, I am an only child, so I talk a lot. So I will do my best to keep things brief. So I have 7 slides, not counting this top one, I think, and my goal is to really go through each of them in 4 to 5 minutes. The first part of this talk will look a little bit at the broader historical context. I'm sure some of you here are very knowledgeable about Israeli-Palestinian history, and some of you may not be, so I'm coming to this sort of assuming no knowledge, even though I know that's probably inaccurate because many people here do have knowledge. And then I'll get in, instead of trying to propose solutions at the end, I've been doing this for 21 years, like between grad school and teaching at DU since 2010. If I could have solved the conflict, I would have. I can't do that. I don't live there. It's, I'm one person, so I can talk about some of the background. And as I tell my students, hopefully some of them will go on to make major contributions, even if it's just sort of making people more aware publicly about, the different groups that are living there and their histories. So please know I'm going into this with very limited goals. So now you've heard all of my academic caveats. So I will start. So I've titled this Context and Impact, or Impact, the Israel-Hamas War of 2023-2024. So I wanted to start a little with the historical background and I'll probably just do this on every slide, the caveat that I can't talk about everything. And this slide looks at sort of the longer term historical background. I've included this map of Gaza, of Israel, Gaza, the West Bank for the first 4 slides. Partly because I am sort of aesthetically, artistically challenged, and I haven't even decorated my office since 2010, so I just use the same thing over and over again. But partly because I want you to get a sense of where it is. I want you to get a sense of where Gaza is. So if you can get a sense of this map over the first 4 slides, I think that's just helpful, just trying to drive that home. So I could go into a great big background pre-1948. I will say just very briefly, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is very much a modern one. It is not a centuries-old conflict. Most historians who study this would really start in the 1880s. We would not start 2,000 years ago when talking about this. And we tend to frame it as a conflict between 2 competing nationalist narratives that developed, the Zionist one a little bit before the Palestinian nationalist one, but both being developed by the time you get to the 1920s. In any case, the State of Israel is founded in 1948. At the same time, a significant amount of Palestinians that would have been in the state of Israel became stateless. Roughly 750,000 of the 900,000 Palestinians who would have lived in the borders of Israel, Israel ended up with 78% of what had been Mandate Palestine, end up as refugees for various reasons. I'm happy to talk about it during Q&A. And so the Palestinians at this time become stateless. Palestinians had rejected UN Resolution 181, which was passed in November 1949. I wanted to add that as context in case someone wants to say, oh, you didn't mention that. But in any case, the vast majority of Palestinians who would have been in the state of Israel and would have actually made it 50-50 Palestinian, or actually slightly more Palestinian than Jewish, end up being stateless. Many of them end up in what becomes known as the Palestinian diaspora. Most end up in the West Bank or Gaza or Jordan. Others end up in Lebanon, Iraq, and some other countries. For the purposes of this talk, I just want to note what happens to the Palestinian territories that were part of Mandate Palestine. So Gaza, which was the smallest one, ends up being ruled by Egypt from 1949 to 1967. There is a brief interlude during the 1956 Suez Crisis War when Israel occupies Gaza, but the United States put significant pressure on Israel under the Eisenhower administration to withdraw. So ultimately, in Gaza, Egypt came back as the occupying power. And if you look at the Sinai Peninsula, which is right to the southwest of Israel, that becomes a demilitarized zone from 1956 to 1967. The West Bank ends up being ruled by Jordan from 1949 to 1967. This includes East Jerusalem. So in the original UN partition plan of 1947, Jerusalem was supposed to actually be an international zone. Both the Jordanians and the Israelis did not allow that to happen. The Israelis end up with West Jerusalem, the Jordanians end up with East Jerusalem. And I will note that a significant number of Jews were expelled from East Jerusalem as a result of this. The Israelis were able to maintain some control over like small areas of East Jerusalem, but they did not control that area. So the next phase I'll talk about is the phase, and I could have broken this up into like 10 different phases, but again, in the interest of brevity, I think this makes some sense. Remember, history is, as we say in the field, history is a foreign country. Modern scholars impose periodization on the past, so different scholars could periodize this differently. This is just for this talk. So I'm taking the period from 1967 to 2005. Hopefully it will make sense as to why I'm choosing these dates. 1967 saw the 1967 war, often known as the Six-Day War. I try to use politically neutral terms, so I don't refer to the 1956 war as the Suez War. I don't refer to the 1967 war as the Six-Day War. I just refer to it as the 1967 war. As a result of the 1967 war, and again, I'm not going to do justice to this background, so please don't think that I'm ignoring what the Israeli government was actually suffering from, which were states massing at their borders. But the outcome of the 1967 war was that Israel won an overwhelming military victory against Egypt, against Syria, and to a lesser, well, not a lesser extent, but against Jordan. Israel increases its land mass by, I believe, over 150 to 200% as a result of this. I might be actually slightly underestimating that. Israel ends up occupying Gaza, the West Bank, annexing East Jerusalem, which was in contravention of international law. They ended up occupying the Golan Heights, which had been part of Syria, and all of the Sinai Peninsula, which had been part of Egypt. So they take over a significant amount of territory. Just to jump ahead, ultimately Israel returns the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt between 1979 and 1982 as a part of the Camp David Peace Accords that were signed in 1979 under the auspices of Jimmy Carter and the United States at Camp David in is it West Virginia or Maryland? Maryland, thank you. So that happens, but the other areas end up continued under Israeli continued occupation. And in fact, the Israeli government annexes the Golan Heights in 1981 in contravention to international law, though it was retroactively accepted by the Trump administration. Took a long time, still considered a contravention of international law, I want to note, even if the United States recognizes it. And again, Israel had already annexed East Jerusalem. Israel acts as the occupying power in the West Bank and Gaza. And pretty quickly after the capture of Gaza and the West Bank, the Israelis do allow the creation of first military and then later civilian settlements in both Gaza and the West Bank, which again is in contravention to international law. Under the Fourth Geneva Convention, you are not allowed to put civilian settlements in a militarily occupied area. So Israel from 1967 to 1987, I mean, it still is, but had sort of set the foundation for the occupation. At the same time in the 1970s, you see the rise of Palestinians trying to take matters into their own hands. From around 1949 to 1967, the Palestinian cause was very much subsumed under sort of the politics of Arab nationalism, but led by Arab states that were recognized, most notably Egypt. The Palestinian Liberation Organization was formed in 1964 in Cairo, but it was very much a tool of Nasser's Egyptian pan-Arab nationalist foreign policy. So Palestinians didn't have a lot of autonomy. After the shock of the '67 war, where Egypt lost and was effectively embarrassed by the Israeli military victory, Palestinians started under the PLO, notably the paramilitary and political organization Fatah, led by Yasser Arafat, started trying to take matters into their own hand. They took over the Palestinian Liberation Organization. They set up shop in Jordan. They were eventually expelled by the Jordanian government. They set up shop in Lebanon. They were eventually expelled by the Israelis in 1982, and they end up having to move to Tunis in Tunisia until the early Oslo Accords in the 1990s. But my point here is in the late 60s and 70s, we see the rise of, I guess you could say, a more militant Palestinian form of resistance and nationalism, but one that gets Palestinians on the political map. Now, early on, although Fatah came out of or had some links with the Muslim Brotherhood, which was a conservative Islamist group that had been founded in 1928 in Egypt, it was also very secular. It adhered to a form of secular sort of left-wing nationalism. Things start to change among Palestinians in the 1980s as it becomes pretty clear that Fatah can't really change the status quo. And you have two important groups that pop up on the Palestinian side in the 1980s. The first is in 1981, Islamic Jihad, which is an avowedly Islamist organization that rejected the Muslim Brotherhood call for slow grassroots revolution and said instead, we need to be more proactive and use military force in order to achieve our political goals. You did have some left-wing groups like the PFLP, which had also advocated similar strategies, but from a secular Marxist perspective, not from an Islamist perspective. And then things really start to change in 1987. And I can't do justice to the outbreak of the First Intifada, but the First Intifada, meaning the first sort of uprising against the Israeli occupation, begins in Gaza, spreads to the West Bank, and becomes this sort of grassroots, often nonviolent, but not solely nonviolent, protest against, by this point, a 20-year Israeli occupation and settlement construction in these areas. And what we see in this period is Yasser Arafat and Fatah, they're actually in Tunis. So they're sort of marginalized from this, or they're far away from what's going on. And it's really Palestinians on the ground in Gaza and Hamas who are taking control. And it's at this point that we see the creation of a new organization that rises to prominence over the next decade, and that's Hamas. So Hamas is formed during the First Intifada, similar to Islamic Jihad, rejecting the past Muslim Brotherhood idea of slow revolution, They still adhere to they still advocate using grassroots supports, building hospitals, providing social services, showing themselves as non-corrupt. Fatah officials were viewed as very corrupt by Palestinians in this point. And Hamas starts off slowly, and the Israeli government sort of views Hamas, not positively, but they view them as a potential counterweight to Fatah, because they feel that if Fatah can be challenged, then they, in a sense, can be ignored in some instances, and as Israel can play one faction against another. I don't want to go too far there. I think there are a lot of people who argue, oh, Israel helped create Hamas and built them up as this strong counterweight to Fatah, and Israel really helped fund Hamas. I mean, there was some support, but I don't think Israel was looking to create this organization that would eventually challenge them. And Hamas, from the beginning, I will note, in their 1988 charter, they call for the destruction of Israel. And in fact, they say negative things about Jews as well, irrespective of whether they're Israeli Jews or not. So Hamas very much starts out as a militant organization with the dedication of creating an Islamic state in Palestine and destroying Israel. So I don't think there's any way around that, but if we do have to understand the context in which they evolved, it was a context of occupation, of 20-year occupation and settlement construction. Now, the first Intifada, which had broken out in 1987, did have some other impacts. So when the Intifada broke out, the Israeli government was in a coalition sharing government, and here I'm going to have to be brief because I think I'm already going to start going over my time limit. And I can talk about the way the Israeli political system works if you want to ask me questions in Q&A, but just to say that Israel's government is a fused parliamentary executive with a unicameral legislature, meaning they have one legislative body, not two, like we do, and the leading faction in that they can get to 61 of the 120 seats in the Knesset gets to choose the prime minister. In the 1980s, Israel had a rotating prime ministership between the Likud and the Labor parties, which were the two main parties. Labor being more sort of center-left, Likud being more center-right or leaning towards right-wing. And so I mention this because although Yitzhak Shamir, who's a Likud member, is the prime minister, it's Yitzhak Rabin, who is the defense minister, who was a former Israeli chief of staff, military chief of staff, and a labor member who was tasked with putting down the Intifada. And he used what was known as the break their bones policy, which is whether or not Palestinians were using nonviolent activism or violent activism, they would be met with a violent response. Rabin does this for a couple years and comes to the conclusion that it was not a viable strategy because they weren't fighting a ragtag group of people who were just disorganized and upset about certain things. They were facing a full-fledged nationalist movement. And you could argue on the Israeli side, it's the impact of the first Intifada that leads Yitzhak Rabin to the conclusion that there should be some sort of political solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So he begins to moderate a bit. I think that his level of moderation has been this is my analytical opinion, has been oversold in the years since. He wasn't looking for a true two-state solution. He was looking for something short of that, where Israel remained a viable, militarized, legitimate state, whereas the Palestinians would get something short of true statehood. They maybe would get a state, but it would be very limited, it would be demilitarized, and Israel would probably control access into and out of, and probably still control key aspects of the airspace. But in any case, between that and the George H.W. Bush administration really having significant issues with Yitzhak Shamir's government coming out of the first Gulf War, and Israel continuing to build settlements in this early post-Cold War world where the US was trying to cultivate new relationships with countries that had formerly been aligned with the Soviet Union. Ultimately, Yitzhak Rabin wins the 1992 election in Israel, becomes the prime minister, and eventually we do get the Oslo Accords in the 1990s, which, although they failed and failed pretty miserably, and there were major criticisms at the very beginning by people like Edward Said, which turned out to be pretty accurate, this was a period of optimism in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, probably the biggest period of optimism we've ever seen. Now, Oslo does fail. I don't have a ton of time to go into that, but I don't think it's controversial to say it fails because of significant divisions within Israeli society and significant divisions within Palestinian society. So one thing that happens in Oslo is that Yasser Arafat and Fatah are allowed to come back from Tunis to Gaza and to the West Bank. One way of reading this is they were willing to sign not the best deal with the Israelis in order to resurrect their own political fortunes because they had in effect been marginalized for over a decade. And this was not always popular among many Palestinians. And in fact, Hamas comes to view Fatah as having sold out the Palestinian national cause. And at the same time, on the Israeli side, the right wing with Likud, now led by Benjamin Netanyahu, come to view the Oslo Accords as a betrayal of Israel's history, that we don't negotiate with Palestinians. Palestinians are, in a sense, a non-people or a people who advocate terrorism. And so what we see in the mid-1990s is both the Likud party under the leadership of Netanyahu in opposition and Hamas trying to derail the Oslo Accords. And this is exacerbated in 1995 when Yitzhak Rabin is assassinated by an Israeli Jewish extremist. And within a year, Benjamin Netanyahu and Likud take over and become the new leadership in Israel from 1996 to 1999. And this really helps stall and maybe, I'm trying to think of a better word, but let's say stall the Oslo Accords. Things look up a bit from 1999 to 2001 when Ehud Barak wins the election. But you might argue that it's too little too late. You might also argue that Yasser Arafat never really prepared Palestinians for the kinds of concessions they would have to make, especially under US mediation, in order to achieve some level of something like bordering but not maybe equaling true independence. And so this eventually breaks down in 2000 and 2001. There are other reasons for this. I'm not trying to ignore Ariel Sharon's visit to the Temple Mount again. It's just in the instance for time. But ultimately, the Oslo Accords fail at the very end of the Clinton presidency in 2001. It also coincides with the rise of the Second Intifada, which is far more violent than the First Intifada. And we see waves of suicide bombers entering Israel, killing and targeting civilians. And this not only leads to a significant escalation of violence between 2000 and 2005, or 2001 and 2005 between Israelis and Palestinians, but it also leads the new US administration under George W. Bush to effectively say, like, the US put too much into this in the 90s, it was a key failure, we're not gonna make that mistake, and the US really disengages from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and turns its attention after September 11th to Afghanistan, for some reason to Iraq, and to fighting the global war on terror, where the only lip service paid to Israeli Palestinians is trying to, in some instances, mitigate tensions so the US could build support among Arab states for the global war on terrorism. So now moving to the medium-term historical background, which gets us up to 2005. The Intifada was devastating for Palestinians over 5,000 Palestinians die during the Intifada based on Israeli military activities, and over 1,500 Israelis also die, largely as a result of attacks on civilians and some attacks on military installations over this period. Ariel Sharon, who becomes the prime minister in 2001 and was a Likud member and was a pretty conservative Likud member, former general of the Israeli Defense Forces, he articulates a desire to have the Israelis withdraw from Gaza, at least their settlements. Now, by this point, the Israeli settlement movement was significant, but it was mostly centered in the West Bank. So depending on how you count Israeli settlers, does East Jerusalem count, does it not count? Let's count East Jerusalem, because I think under international law it would count. there were probably close to 600,000 settlers at this point, which represented, just to give you a sense, 1 out of every 10 Israeli Jews. So a significant number. But only 8,000 lived in Gaza, where Israel controlled 40% of the land, and at that point, 1.4 million Gazans lived in the other 60% of the territory. From Sharon's perspective, I think there were 2 ways to approach looking at this. I think many people who are sympathetic to him said Ariel Sharon is looking to, and you heard this a lot in US media as well, Ariel Sharon is looking to unilaterally withdraw Israeli settlers from Gaza, and Israel's willing to do something to alleviate this situation. And look, the Israelis recognize the realities, and they're now out of Gaza. I think a different way of looking at it is Sharon kind of knew that uprooting 8,000 people would upset a lot of people in Israel, and it effectively allowed him to cement the Israeli settlements in the West Bank going forward, which would ensure, if there ever was one, a smaller, viable Palestinian state. In any case, this does happen. There's been a debate since. Some people, especially in Israel, will argue that Israel is no longer the occupying power in Gaza because their military and their settlers left, at least on the ground. I think most international legal experts would disagree with that and would say that Israel remained the occupying power in Gaza because it continued to control access into and out of. It continued to control the airspace and the coastal approaches, with the exception of the Egyptian border. The one thing that it did do is it took Israel Israel was no longer in contravention of the Fourth Geneva Convention. So Israel was no longer breaking international law by withdrawing settlers from Gaza. But the aftermath of the Israeli withdrawal has not necessarily, by the way, this is not me advocating for the Israeli settlements in Gaza, please be clear when I say this, but the aftermath was not positive. The United States maybe made a pretty major policy mistake by effectively forcing a democratic vote in Gaza and the West Bank at a time when Fatah had been reduced to being viewed as sort of a corrupt puppet of the West that was powerless, and Hamas was being viewed as a more positive, even if people didn't agree with all of their politics, as more of a positive group that had helped drive the Israeli settlers out of Gaza. And so the United States, tries to get the Palestinians, puts a lot of pressure on them and Israel to allow it, Palestinians to have legislative, not presidential. They had Mahmoud Abbas as their president after Yasser Arafat died, and he's a member of Fatah, but Palestinian legislative elections. Hamas wins these legislative elections, both in Gaza and the West Bank. And this is a really key period, this period from around 2006 to 2007. First of all, it sees a major military confrontation between Israel and Hezbollah, which is a Shiite militant organization centered in southern and central Lebanon that is supported and trained by Iran. And at the same time in Gaza, there is a civil war taking place between Hamas and Fatah, and Hamas eventually pretty easily wins the civil war, drives Fatah out of Gaza, and now you have a divided Palestinian political situation where Hamas rules Gaza, Fatah rules the West Bank, and over the next decade or so, the United States and to an extent Israel have tried to play one off against one another, supporting Fatah and blockading Hamas. And Fatah still had to deal with a lot of issues, continued Israeli settlement construction, trying to get the U.S. to put pressure on Israel that the Obama administration tried to do in some instances, but was unable to do for various reasons, including infighting within the administration itself, but including after 2010, a Republican majority in the House of Representatives, which would not allow them to do so. And we also see an Israeli-Egyptian blockade of Gaza that begins, it loosens a little when there's a revolution in Egypt, but it's re-strengthened afterwards. So Gaza, since 2007, has really, and this was already an extremely poor area with extremely high youth unemployment and an extremely large population crammed into a small area. Population has grown, the economic situation has deteriorated, There's something, even prior to the most recent conflict, there was something like 50 to 60% unemployment. There's significant amounts of poverty. So this was just an area that even prior to 2007 was really suffering, and since 2007 has been significantly suffering. All right, so getting up to 2007 to 2023, there have also been major conflicts. So the Israel-Hezbollah war, maybe you could say the Second Intifada, but the Israel-Hezbollah war in 2006 really heralded a period of Israelis fighting non-state actors. I haven't talked about this, but if we periodize the Arab-Israeli, Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's not a perfect, please note, what I'm saying is not perfect. It's not a perfect capture or description of this. But I think from 1948 to 1973, we saw pretty much conventional military conflicts between states, between Israel and other Arab states that had their own militaries, that had their own economies. That changed in the mid-1970s, especially once we start to see a détente between Israel and Egypt. That was really actually helped along, I know he's not someone who's super popular in progressive political circles, but by Henry Kissinger in the mid-1970s, which eventually leads to the Camp David peace accords between Israel and Egypt in 1979. There's another peace deal with Jordan in 1944. And what we've seen since the early 1980s, but really accelerated in the 2000s, is a shift from conventional war to non-conventional war, meaning that Israel has continued to engage in military conflicts, but they've been against non-state actors. They've been against Hezbollah in 2006, they've been against Hamas. So we see this repeatedly happen over the last 15 years. 2008, 2009, some of you may remember this, during the transition of power in the United States from the Bush administration to the Obama administration, which was obviously overshadowed by the global financial crisis, so people may not have been paying as close attention. There was a major conflict between Israel and Hamas. There was another one that was short-lasted, about a week in 2012. And then there was a much more significant one in 2014. There have been other bouts of violence that have popped up in the meantime, most notably probably in 2021, when there was significant violence along the Israeli-Gazan border. So there have been sort of these outbursts of violence. I think from the Israeli side, their goal over the last 20 years has been to try to manage this conflict, to try to, in some instances, provide small amounts of carrots to Fatah to pacify the West Bank, and to try to reach some sort of stalemate with Hamas, where Hamas would no longer be willing to launch major attacks against the Israelis. But there are a couple other things that happened during this time as well. First of all, over the last 20 years, Israel has emerged into an extremely developed economy. This was not the case in the 1980s or even the early 1990s. Israel has really become one of the leading, and certainly on a per capita basis, has become the leading technological power in the world. We have Silicon Valley in the United States. We also have sort of the Boston 128 biotech area. China has a significant technology area. But if we look at the NASDAQ exchange is an exchange on Wall Street that lists technology companies. Israel is third in terms of the number of technology companies it has on the exchange, behind only the United States and China, which is pretty impressive when you consider the US has 340 million people, China has 1.4 billion people, and Israel has 9 million people, or 10 million people. So the Israeli tech economy has really launched Israel into a new economic stratosphere. It did create a significant amount of inequality within Israel, and a lot of the domestic turmoil in the state has actually been linked to a combination of unaffordable housing prices for young people, which is very similar to what's happened in major urban centers in the United States, but also battles between more left-wing secular or even centrist secular Israelis and more right-wing Israelis over what Israeli law should be on various issues, including the Supreme Court's power to overturn Knesset, laws that the Knesset tries to pass, and also trying to interject more religion into public society, especially public Jewish society. So these have become some of the main issues. That's not to say that, security dropped off. It did not, but the Palestinian issue became one of many in Israeli society. And with the creation of the security barrier in the mid-2000s, many Israelis became, I think, this is not on the whole, I mean, it is, I would say on the whole, but it doesn't mean that security was not on their minds, but had become sort of safer, felt more of a sense of safety. Not everybody, and certainly not people who lived on the Gaza border or the Lebanon border. But throughout much of the country, I think that was the case. At the same time, you have the Abraham Accords, which pop up under the Trump administration, which effectively allow Israel to enter into formal relations with Arab states without solving the Palestinian crisis. This was something that was unthinkable when I was in grad school in the 2000s. And I think what it started to show, or at least convince people of, and I actually started to think I was wrong, and I think I probably still am, with my thoughts that there needed to be a real solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict before Israel would be accepted into the wider Middle East. That I think I was proven to be wrong. Things changed over the course of the 2000s and 2010s. I think much of the rest of the world stopped paying attention to the Palestinian issue as much, partly I think because of the global financial crisis, partly because of issues elsewhere, the rise of China, other things going on in Southeast Asia, in Myanmar. I mean, there were other conflicts that were going on that captured the world's attention. More recently, the Russia-Ukraine invasion. But then I think another major issue was the Iranian attempt to build a nuclear program, because this didn't just scare Israel. This scared many of the Gulf states and many of the Sunni Arab states, which viewed Iran as a destabilizing force in the region. And so what started happening over the last 15 years, which again would have probably been unthinkable even as recently as 2004, 2005, was that Israel was able to create significant back-channel negotiation channels, sorry, that's redundant, to create back-channel negotiations with Gulf Arab states, especially Saudi Arabia, the United Emirates, Bahrain, which really feared Iran. And these groups were willing to work together with the United States, again, secretly, in order to try to contain Iran. And I think that this sort of comes to fruition with the Abraham Accords. And I mention all of this because by the time you get to 2021, from my perspective, it basically seemed like the Palestinian issue was on the back burner, not just in the United States and not just in Israel, but in the Gulf as well, and among the Gulf Arab states as well. And I think that this, as much as anything, in addition to obviously the horrific conditions in Gaza, helped create the conditions for what we've seen more recently. And I think one other thing that's worth pointing out is that in the summer of 2023, Israel was rocked with its most significant political protests, certainly since 2011, when many younger Israelis took to the streets in Tel Aviv complaining about a high cost of living, but probably since the 1982 Lebanon War, when about 400,000 Israelis took to the streets protesting that conflict as a war of choice, not a war of necessity. And I think that this maybe showed, or at least convinced some people, some Palestinian leaders in Hamas, that Israel was sort of ripe for attack, that their society was more divided than it had ever been. I do actually think its society, maybe since the Oslo Accords, had probably been more divided than it had ever been. So this leads me, I'm almost done, I promise. I know I'm talking a lot. I'll leave time for questions. This leads to October 7th, 2023, in the immediate aftermath. And again, I didn't want to talk as much about this. I wanted to sort of help you understand maybe some of the ways that we got here. But just, I do think it's important, especially if people have not followed this, just to note some of the developments we've seen on the next two slides. So on October 7th, members of Hamas and some other Palestinian militant organizations and even civilians launched a three-pronged assault, a multi-pronged assault on Israel by air, by sea, by land, breaching the Israeli security border at Gaza. Over the course of the next couple days, they took over 240 hostages. They killed over 1,200 people. We know that there are numerous instances of sexual violence, of torture, and of murder, which I just want to say clearly are war crimes. I mean, these are war crimes under any definition. And this led to a significant, from the Israeli situation. And I hate constantly talking about like attack and retaliation. I think we could start much earlier and talk about attack and retaliation from both groups. But from the Israeli perspective, there was this sense, we need to do something. We need to retaliate with the full force of our military. We need to get the hostages back. And you see a massive Israeli bombardment and invasion begin within days. I say within days because Palestinians were still fighting battles on Israeli territory for a few days after this, which really shocked Israel and which really drove home the extent to which the Hamas had built tunnels underneath Gaza. And so I tried to show on a map where the attacks were on Israel, so you can see they're all around. Coming right outside of the Gaza borders. Sorry, I'll get to, I have one more slide, I lied. And I know you can't really see this very well. I'm happy to email anyone my PowerPoint, just so you know. I didn't put my name on this. I'm the only Jonathan on the Department of History's website at DU. I'm also the only Jonathan on the Center for Judaic Studies website at DU. So the photo on the left shows where Israel has attacked in Gaza, whether through land operations or launching bombs. So you can see a very significant amount of Gaza has come under attack. This is from The Economist, by the way, which is a British weekly publication. If we look at the amount of buildings that have been destroyed, roughly, I believe, 21 to 30% of Palestinian buildings in Gaza have been destroyed since October 7th. If we look on the right, we see the death toll. So the death toll, and I'm not minimizing the one on the bottom, that is a significant death toll. It's the most, Israel lost more people on October 7th than they had lost in their history on any given day, like within the state. And I think even including their the wars that they have fought. But we'll see, the Israeli numbers were high, 1,250, and this is as of around January 9th or 10th, about 1,345 confirmed deaths and thousands of other casualties, and I'm not minimizing that. If we look on the Palestinian side, there have been over 23,800 people killed, including tens of thousands of other people who were injured. And just to put this in perspective, 1% of the population in Gaza has died since October 7th. I try to put this in American perspective for my students. That would be as if in the last 5 months, 3.4 million Americans died in a conflict. Something like 80 to 85% of Palestinians in Gaza have had to flee their homes. To put that in perspective in the United States, that would be like if something on the order of 260 million people became homeless. And that 30% of them didn't even have a home to go back to. So these are some of the consequences of the conflict we have seen. So I'm not going to get into the specific strategy and all of that stuff. It's important for me to honor life and to honor civilians on both sides, so to highlight the scale of death that we have seen here. So this is my last slide, and then I will leave it open to questions. Mary Jo had asked me to talk maybe about prospects for peace. I'm someone who, I hope I'm wrong, because I'm wrong on a lot of things. I've predicted I'm from New England, I've predicted a lot of Celtics and Red Sox and Bruins victories that just did not happen. I went into the 2008 Super Bowl really bullish that the undefeated Patriots would beat the Giants. I was sadly mistaken. 2003 with the Red Sox Yankees, I won't talk about that. But so I am someone who am not bullish on peace, but that doesn't mean I'm right. I hope I am wrong on this. But I think before we talk about prospects for peace, which I really won't here, I'm happy to talk about any Q&A. I think that we have questions to answer first. And so this is not an exhaustive list, it's just sort of some questions I wanted to put out there for you to consider and I consider them all the time, before we can even talk about this. So the first question is, how do we even resolve the current conflict? Will hostages be released? Will Hamas survive? If Hamas does not survive the conflict, who's going to rule Gaza? The Fatah has already said that they don't really want to rule Gaza on the backs of an Israeli military victory. The Israelis, outside of some right-wing members who have talked about building Israeli settlements there, don't really want to rule Gaza. They disengaged for this reason 20 years ago, partly so they could also ensure a Jewish majority in the state of Israel. They didn't want to ever see Gaza be annexed for that reason. So who rules in Gaza? Who governs in Israel? Israel's going to face a major political test after this conflict in a way that they have not faced since some of the shock of the 1973 war, which I was not alive for, but I've read a lot about. So, and we can talk more about that in Q&A. I can't talk about all of this, but maybe. Will U.S. policy and opinion shift? One major impact of this conflict, and we started seeing this in 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, so this is not new, but people are paying more attention to it. There's not much of a shift on the Republican side, and in fact, most Republicans, with the exception of some far-right members of the Republican Party, have really rallied around Israel, and we've seen this among many older Democrats, but among many younger Democrats, large or progressive Democrats. And when I say younger Democrats, I'm not talking about people in their 20s. I'm talking about people probably under 50 who've becoming extremely critical and increasingly critical of Israel. And it's really Democrats who are protesting in the United States or other progressives, so I shouldn't say it's just Democrats, against Biden's support for Israel during this war. And so this has really opened up cleavages within the American, I don't even know if I should say left, but among leftists, among liberals, among progressives. And we're not sure where this will lead. In the short term, it might actually lead to Trump winning the re-election, which would actually lead to probably a more pro-Israel position from the United States. In the long run, it could lead to, it is already doing this, significant debates in the Democratic Party, which could also lead to an erosion of support in the Democratic Party and a reduction of bipartisan support for Israel in the United States. And so the question, is the two-state solution dead? There are different perspectives on this. I think in academia, most people had concluded within the last decade that the two-state solution was pretty much dead, partly as a result of the fact that these parties, don't really trust or want to talk to each other, partly as a result of the U.S. seems to be losing leverage over both groups over time, partly as a result that there have been so many settlements constructed in the West Bank that it's really impossible or nearly impossible to create a contiguous state in the West Bank without the Israelis having to uproot settlers, which might lead to a civil war within Israel. And none of this that I'm even getting to, I just want to note, even gets into the issues of Israeli democracy, where they can't even form stable coalitions in order to be able to carry through a policy. And that, by the way, is not even getting into Palestinian politics, where their leaders lack total legitimacy among their people, and it's unclear who would win an election if one were actually held. So I'm sorry I have to end on that down note. I'm optimistic, as I tell everyone, I'm optimistic in life in general, but when it comes to this, I'm more realist, and I hope that I am totally wrong. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I've spent a lot of time in Gaza and Israel, and I learned so much, so thank you, thank you. We have about 8 minutes for questions, so I have to go to Mark first, of course.
I'm trying to figure out how to ask this. What's your assessment of some claims that I've heard recently that Israel is in negotiations to export the remaining population of Gazans to other countries in Africa or other places in the world?
Sure, and this is certainly one of the things, and I didn't get into this, but these political statements made by some members of the far-right government in Israel have led to accusations of ethnic cleansing and genocide, which are being adjudicated at the ICJJ right now. I'm not privy to what their war cabinet is talking about. We found out last night that even assistants to the leaders are not privy to what the war cabinet is talking about. I don't think that that's something that the Netanyahu government is seriously considering, because I think that that's a major red line for the United States. I think that that's also a major red line for the Gulf countries that Israel wants to maintain relationships with, and also the key one, Saudi Arabia, that it wants to establish formal relations with in a couple of years. And I do think doing that would lead Israel to become an international pariah. And Israel's already lost a significant amount of international support, not just in what many people refer to as the global south, where it didn't really have very much international support, but especially in Europe and especially among key constituents in the Democratic Party in the US. So I do think that there are people in Israel like Itamar Ben-Gvir who hope that happens and would support such a policy, but I don't think the government as a whole would be willing to do that. Especially, they have a unity government with Benny Gantz right now, and he takes a pretty hard line when it comes to Gaza, but I think that he would totally oppose what would clearly be a major violation of international law.
Get to you.
Hello, fellow New Englander, so wasn't all bad though. The one thing I don't understand, and it seems like this should be knowable, pre-1948, what was the status of Palestine as a country, a state, and in the territories ultimately where Israel was formed?
Sure. So first of all, I even in class I referred to something as Ottoman Palestine, but there was no one Ottoman Palestine. It was made up of multiple political jurisdictions. The area came under one formal jurisdiction in the early 1920s during the British Mandate, which was granted to the British effectively by themselves, but by the League of Nations. And the British had the mandate from 1921 to 1948. What the British did was they looked at Jews as being a national people, whereas they looked at the Palestinians who lived there as just being the indigenous people who were there, but were not a national people. So the British allowed the Zionist Jews to create their own political, educational institutions, whereas they did not allow Palestinians to do that. They allowed Jews to, first of all, they even allowed Zionist Jews to take over the institutions of non-Zionist Jewish groups that had been there for long periods of time. And so what we see in the 1920s and 1930s, first of all, is a major increase in Jewish immigration. Jews go from around 10% of the population in 1918 to about 33% of the population by 1940. They're able to create their own proto-state institutions. And then there is a massive Palestinian uprising against the British and against the Zionists in 1936 to 1939. The British crushed this through aerial bombardment and military invasion and either kill, injure, or arrest 10% of Palestinian men during this period. Now they do then in 1939 limit Jewish immigration in they put some pretty restrictive guidelines there, partly because World War II is breaking out. They want to ensure stability in the region, and they effectively reversed their support for Zionism. But I think you could argue they had already allowed the creation of these proto-institutions that led to a state within a state. One thing I'll note is that because of what the British did in 1939, even though I think it's inarguable that they helped create the foundations for a Jewish state, they are viewed negatively in both Israeli Zionist and Palestinian nationalist narratives, because Palestinians view them as a group that never viewed them as a national people, that gave this territory to Zionists. I say Zionist not because I'm like an Iranian official who won't say the word Israel. Israel didn't exist at the time. Whereas on the Israeli Jewish side, British are viewed as people who stabbed them in the back right at the time of the beginnings of the Holocaust. And I will note one more thing, sorry, I always throw in too much context. Part of the reason why so many Jews ended up in Palestine, especially in the 1930s, is because the United States put an immigration restriction law on the books in 1929, which targeted various groups, including Jews, trying to limit the amount of Jewish immigration into the United States, but they did that for Catholics and Greek Orthodox Christians as well.
How would you characterize the role of religion in this mess?
So what's interesting here, and I'll give a cursory answer because it's not my main area of specialty. So I'll just say what I will say very simply, and I'm happy to point you to other books if anyone ever wants to email me. I think early on this was not a conflict that was centered on religion. It was a conflict that was centered on often secular nationalism that, yes, was informed by religion. There's no doubt that even secular Jews looked to the Old Testament as sort of like a map of where Jews had a claim to the area. But it started out very much as a secular battle over land and over resources. I think the religious component has really shifted over time and became extremely important in the 1980s and 1990s. That's not to say it played no role before, but what we've seen is the rise of Islamist organizations in the 1980s and 1990s that challenged the Palestinian secular nationalist leaders. And on the Israeli side, we've seen an increasing amount of religiosity, both in the public sphere, but also in terms of demographics. So if you went back to the 1970s, 60% of Israeli Jews, 60 to 80% of Israeli Jews identified as secular. That is down to 40% now, and it will probably be down to something like 20% by the time we get to mid-century, because the more religious Jewish populations are having far more children than the secular Jewish populations. And so religion over time has come to play a major role. On the other hand, there are people, and when I went to Israel in 2014 as part of a trip through Tel Aviv University, and I met with the Grand Rabbi of Denmark, who was he was a dual Israeli Danish citizen. He was an Israeli Knesset leader. He was a left-wing religious leader. And he made the point to us that because religion had become such a key part of the conflict, that it cannot be just co-opted by the right, that there have to be left-wing religious voices that are making, that are making arguments there. And it's not identical, but I think we see something similar happening with some left-wing members of the evangelical Christian movement within the United States who are making similar claims that the left needs to do a better job of engaging in some sort of religious rhetoric and meeting religious constituents to try to change minds on various issues.
I'm afraid maybe one last, I was going to say we don't have more time, but time for one last quick question, and then hopefully Professor Sharkey.
I'm willing to stay, I'm also willing to stay a couple of minutes. If I go home, I'm going to get yelled at by my kids, so it's okay.
Thank you. So many questions. I'll go with this one. I'm curious about why you refer to Hamas as a non-state actor after the 2007 elections. Could you say a little more about their democratic legitimacy, and have there just been no elections for 16 years? I'm unfamiliar.
Yeah, so that's a good point. I think you could refer to Hamas in many ways as a state actor, except that it doesn't fully control everything within its borders. And there I'm talking about the sea, the land. It's effectively been cut off from the international community. It is also not recognized by many countries around the world. But I do agree with you. I think that that's a really legitimate critique of what I was saying, that I think Hamas falls somewhere in between. Now, in terms of the level of legitimacy that they have in Gaza, it's pretty unclear. There have been polls that have come out that have shown that Hamas is not super popular in Gaza, and the only way that they are able to maintain control is effectively by crushing all dissent within Gaza. Hamas, although they paid lip service to democracy in the 2000s when they came to power, have certainly not been an organization that is committed to democratic and certainly not liberal democratic principles. And so it's unclear what would happen if there were an actual election. There was a really good newspaper article in Haaretz, which is a kind of a left-wing Israeli newspaper, that noted that although Gazan journalists have become viewed as heroes in this conflict, and over 114 Palestinian or Arab journalists have died, whether in Lebanon, whether in Gaza, since this conflict began, Hamas does not let them does not let them cover critically anything to do with Hamas itself or the Palestinian war effort. They're effectively allowed to report as long as they're only talking about what Israel is doing, not what Hamas is doing. So I'm sorry that doesn't quite get into all of the answers, but thank you for bringing that up, because I think when you're getting into Hamas, it's tough to call them. They are, in my view, they are a non-state actor because there is no state of Palestine, right? But in terms of have they been operating as a government? They have been. So it's kind of in between there.
I actually have one more, so I'm being allowed to ask a question. I have heard this, I'm not sure if this is true, but I've heard that from the evangelical Christian, the United States evangelical Christian community, they are pouring money into Israel and have significant influence because of their support of settlements. And do you know anything about that?
I mean, I can talk about it from a historical perspective. I'm not sure about the numbers today. I think there's long been an argument, how come Israel has such strong bipartisan support in the United States? By the way, this is a simplification, and I'm not saying it's accurate or even totally accurate. The argument has long been that the Democratic Party is home to the vast majority of Jewish voters in the United States. Something like 70 to 75% of American Jews vote Democrat. That number is higher when you exclude Orthodox American Jews. And so the Democratic Party has often tended to have a pro-Israel tilt. I think there are other reasons for that, including this idea in the 50s and 60s that Israel was sort of like a quasi-socialist country, and they gained a lot of support from labor unions and other groups who saw them as a persecuted people and as victims. On the Republican side, especially since the 1970s, I think it's pretty clear that the base of support in that party has been linked in a very small way to some right-wing Jews who support that, but in a much different way to evangelical Christians who outnumber American Jews, I just want to note, by a factor of probably, I was going to say 70, that's not wrong, probably 10. Evangelical Christians, I think, have been central to the support in the Republican Party. We saw this a lot during the Second Intifada, where the Bush administration at one point tried to criticize the Israelis really lightly for some of their actions. Evangelical Christians organized a letter-writing campaign to George W. Bush, who himself identified as evangelical Christian, saying that his government, the U.S. government, should not be putting any pressure on Israel. And there has been we've had a long history of significant monetary contributions coming from evangelical Christians supporting settlement construction and advocating for more military aid to Israel. So that is certainly part of it. In the more recent period, I can't tell you what the numbers would look like.
Thank you for your offer to keep talking. We have to, Kate, who does a wonderful job with our sound, has to get over to do the 11 o'clock. So maybe if people have more questions, you can just come up and talk personally to Professor Sharkin afterwards. I just want to make a couple of plugs. This turnout is fantastic. I'm so thrilled to see so many people. Next Sunday, instead of an adult ed, we are going to be walking with Temple Micah, walking the scrolls over to the church. So that will be a really great event, and hopefully everybody can take part in that. The Sunday after that is the congregational meeting, and then after that we go back to adult ed and have a 3-part series of the Sacred Art of Black Preaching, which I think is going to be super exciting, and then a 4-part series on mental health issues facing our community, and then 4 weeks on kind of earth care and climate change and what's going on with the environment. So lots of great topics. I hope we keep these great numbers coming, and thank you, Professor Sharkin, for this morning.